Imagine for a second that you have a computer.
Okay.
And it's a super reliable machine, right?
Right.
But it's running on this incredibly old foundational software.
Like a legacy operating system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was built literally from the ground up for one specific highly specialized task. But then imagine that the entire world around you just changes overnight.
Right. The environment shifts.
Yeah. The network protocols update, the global market shifts, and suddenly that one specific task your computer was built for, it's just no longer enough to keep you connected or competitive or, even functioning.
Which is a terrifying realization.
It really is. Because you realize the inevitable. You have to wipe the hard drive. You have to install an entirely new, incredibly complex operating system just to survive in this new network. But here is the massive, seemingly insurmountable catch.
What's the catch?
You cannot turn the computer off.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that defies the logic of how we understand system architecture entirely. You are talking about hot swapping the very core of a functioning system, like its entire identity, without letting it crash.
Exactly.
I mean, that requires a level of precision, timing, and adaptability that is usually reserved for, well, theoretical exercises.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because what we are exploring today isn't a computer network. We are talking about a country.
A real-world nation.
Yes.
Okay.
We are looking at a nation that pulled off exactly that kind real-time foundational reboot over the span of just a few decades.
It's fascinating.
Today, we are taking a deep dive into Grenada. It is a small island developing state, which you'll sometimes hear referred to as a SIDs, located down in the Caribbean.
Right.
And to understand the mechanics of how they manage this massive structural pivot, we're working through a truly fascinating stack of sources today.
We really have some incredible material to go through.
We do. At the center of this is a comprehensive 15-page academic report titled Grenada, Transition and Challenges of a Small Island Developing State.
And what makes this report so compelling, isn't just the academic theory. It is entirely grounded in multidimensional historical data from the World Bank.
Yeah, stretching all the way back to 1960.
Exactly, and bringing us right up to 2023. The sheer density of this data gives us a rare, basically unobstructed view of a national evolution.
So our mission for this deep dive is to synthesize that data. We are going to analyze 15 distinct dimensions of Grenada's growth logic that are outlined in the research.
Right. We'll look at the underlying mechanics of its transition, its systemic vulnerabilities, and ultimately what the data suggests about its future potential.
And to set the stage before we start pulling apart all the individual threads, the immediate context laid out on page 1 of the research is this. Starting in the 1970s, Grenada underwent a massive systemic economic transformation.
A total structural shift.
Yeah. They shifted from an economy driven almost entirely by agriculture, the old operating system, if you will, to an economy driven by services.
And the top-line success of this pivot is undeniably staggering.
It really is.
When you look at national income, specifically real GDP per capita measured in 2015 constant dollars.
Which filters out the noise of inflation, right?
Exactly. It jumped from roughly $3,040 in 1977 to over $10,000 in recent years.
That is a massive leap.
What's fascinating here is how a tiny island nation perfectly illustrates the extreme highs and the perilous lows of modern global integration.
How so?
Well, when we analyze massive economies, say, the United States or the European Union, the data often gets muddied. I mean, they have vast internal markets that buffer external shocks.
Right, and complex, diversified industries that can kind of hide regional failure.
Exactly. But with a small island developing state like Grenada, the data is incredibly sharp. You see the immediate visceral impact of global trends, demographic shifts, and external economic shocks playing out in real time.
It's like looking at the global economy under an electron microscope.
That's a great way to put it.
Every variable is magnified. So my instinct here is to jump straight into the money. The GDP, the trade balances, the financial metrics.
Sure, the flashy stuff.
Yeah. But before a country can rewrite its economic software, it needs to look at the hardware.
The people.
Exactly. The actual human beings participating in this system. This brings us to part 1, the demographic realities and the health of the population, which the report covers extensively on pages 2 and 10.
The human foundation is really the only logical starting point. I mean, Economies do not exist in a vacuum. They are emergent properties of human behavior.
Mhm.
And the demographic data tracks a profoundly disruptive structural squeeze over the last 6 decades.
The population squeeze. The data details a transition from a period of rapid expansion in the mid-20th century to one of stable and eventually very low growth.
Yeah, if you look at the annual population growth rate between 1960 and 2023, the extreme volatility in the mid-1970s really catches the eye.
The growth rate is jumping up and down violently.
But after that period of instability, it settles into a steady, undeniable downward trend.
And that downward trend eventually crosses a critical threshold.
It does. The data isolates a negative growth phase that begins right after the year 2000.
Wait, negative growth?
Yeah. For a significant period in the 21st century, Grenada's population wasn't just growing slowly, it was actively shrinking.
Which feels completely counterintuitive when you think about the standard narrative of developing nations.
It really does.
I mean, we usually picture exploding populations, overcrowded infrastructure, a massive boon of youth entering the workforce. But Grenada is experiencing the exact opposite.
Right.
If I had to guess, looking at a shrinking population in a developing nation post-2000, my first instinct would be some sort of public health crisis.
Sure, that would be the logical assumption.
But we know from the broader context of the report that their health outcomes are actually improving. So if people aren't dying at higher rates, this negative growth has to be driven by people leaving, right? Like a brain drain.
That is half the equation, and the data absolutely confirms it. The population drain is driven by a potent combination of two factors. First, as you said, emigration.
People moving away.
Right. You have people leaving the island, very often the young, ambitious, and educated workforce seeking wider economic opportunities in North America or Europe.
Which has to hurt.
It's a classic, persistent challenge for these small island states. They invest heavily in educating their youth, only to see that human capital exported.
And the second factor.
Operating simultaneously, you have declining fertility rates. The people who are staying on the island are simply having far fewer children than the generations before them.
I was trying to picture what that actually feels like on the ground, for the listener. It's like a crowded, chaotic youth hostel slowly turning into a quiet, established boutique hotel.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
And the report gives us the exact numbers to back up that shift. The youth population, meaning kids aged 0 to 14, plummeted from 47.3% of the total population in 1960 to around 20% by the late 1990s.
That is a staggering drop.
Think about the physical reality of that. Half the country used to be children. Everywhere you looked, kids. Now it's barely 1 in 5. The era of aging has officially begun.
And the societal implications of that shift are monumental. I mean, when nearly 50% of your population is under 14, your national resources are entirely consumed by sheer volume.
Just keeping up with the numbers.
Exactly. You are constantly building primary schools, expanding pediatric care, and just trying to keep up with the influx of new citizens. But when that youth cohort drops to 20%, the dependency ratio completely flips. You suddenly have a growing proportion of older adults.
Which completely changes the demands on the state. You basically stop building playgrounds and start worrying about pensions.
Exactly.
And this ties directly into the health data on page 10. Because an aging population doesn't just happen because of fewer births. It happens because the people who are there are living significantly longer.
Right. The medical system in Grenada clearly underwent its own transformation alongside the economy. The longevity metrics are a real testament to that progress.
Let's talk about those numbers.
So, the data tracks the probability of a woman surviving to age 65. In 1960, that probability was 67.4%.
Okay.
Today, that has surged to over 82.7%. That is a massive leap in generational survival.
Wow. Over 82%.
Yeah. And perhaps even more indicative of foundational public health improvements, the under 5 mortality rate experienced a steep, cliff-like drop over the same period.
A cliff-like drop. That phrase really sticks with you.
It does.
The absolute tragedy of losing a child before their 5th birthday, something that was statistically quite common, almost an expected part of family life in the mid-20th century, has been largely eradicated.
The visual representation of this data in the report is striking. The mortality numbers just narrow down into a tiny fraction of what they used to be, massively improving national well-being.
But this leads to a somewhat dark but necessary deduction, doesn't it?
How do you mean?
Well, so we have fewer kids, but people are living much longer. Surely that changes what people are actually dying from. You don't just extend life expectancy by 2 decades without changing the mortality profile.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. The demographic transition triggers a profound epidemiological transition.
Okay, unpack that.
The report explicitly notes a rising proportion of deaths from non-communicable diseases, or NCDs. We're talking about conditions like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and various cancers.
Basically, the diseases of getting older, the wear and tear on the human machine.
Yes. And while longevity is up, the shift from communicable to non-communicable diseases places a totally different type of chronic strain on the healthcare system.
Because it's a different kind of treatment.
Exactly. When a nation is fighting communicable diseases or infant mortality, the public health interventions are often acute and relatively low cost at scale.
Like vaccination campaigns.
Right. Vaccines, basic sanitation infrastructure, immediate emergency care for infections. But NCDs require decades of active management.
Oh, I see.
They require ongoing expensive daily medication, specialized dietary interventions, sophisticated diagnostic equipment, and eventually extensive geriatric care facilities.
So while that cliff-like drop in child mortality is a massive historic victory, it essentially buys the country a new, incredibly expensive set of public health challenges.
It is the paradox of progress. You successfully solve one existential crisis only to uncover a longer-term, much more insidious one waiting behind it.
Managing an aging population with high rates of chronic illnesses is arguably the defining healthcare challenge of our century globally, and this tiny island nation is dealing with it head-on.
Which underscores why the demographic and health data provides the necessary lens for everything else we're going to discuss.
Right.
Grenada didn't just decide to change its economy in a vacuum. Its underlying population fundamentally changed its shape, its age distribution, and its physiological needs.
The transition to a service economy had to happen, in part because the old agrarian model couldn't support the changing demographics. That makes total sense. I mean, you can't have an aging population doing back-breaking agricultural labor.
Precisely.
So we know the population is shrinking, and it's getting older.
Yeah.
But what about their capabilities? If you were going to uninstall that agricultural software and reboot as a global service economy, you need people who know how to operate the new system.
You need a completely different kind of worker.
Yeah. So let's look at how Grenada prepared its citizens for this massive economic pivot, focusing on the human capital engine detailed on pages 8 and 9 of the research.
Education is often called the great equalizer, but in the context of economic structural reform, it is the great enabler.
The enabler. I like that.
The data on resource allocation and coverage reveals a very deliberate strategy. Primary school gross enrollment in Grenada is effectively universal. It hovers right around 100%.
Basically, every child is entering the system. Right, but getting kids into a classroom is only step one. Well, there are plenty of developing nations with high enrollment rates, but when you look inside the actual classrooms, it's one exhausted, underpaid teacher trying to manage 60 kids.
That's crowd control, not education.
Exactly. But the data here shows a very different operational reality, doesn't it?
It does. The key metric that stands out is the student-to-teacher ratio for primary education. It improved dramatically, dropping from 37.9 students per teacher in the 1970s down to just 16.4 recently.
That is a huge drop.
It signifies a massive optimization of educational resources. It isn't just about getting kids in seats, it's about giving them actual attention.
Right, and if we tie this back to the demographic data we just discussed, the population squeeze actually works to their advantage here, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, if the youth population drops from 47% down to 20%, the absolute number of children entering the school system plummets. So the government didn't necessarily have to hire double the amount of teachers to have the class size. They just had to maintain their educational investment while the demographic wave receded.
That is a very astute connection. The demographic dividend allowed them to deepen the quality of education without bankrupting the state.
It's a brilliant capitalization on a demographic shift.
And the research highlights another critical layer to this human capital engine, the shifting gender dynamics.
Oh, this part was fascinating.
When comparing primary, secondary, and tertiary enrollment, a distinct structural flip occurs as students age. In basic primary education, enrollment is roughly equal between boys and girls.
Makes sense.
But as the level of education gets higher, female participation aggressively outpaces male participation. Women have decisively surpassed men in both secondary and tertiary education enrollment.
So why does that happen? Why do the young men drop out of the system while the young women continue into higher education?
It is a hallmark indicator of an economy in mid-transition. In a traditional agrarian or deeply physical economy, manual labor offers immediate, albeit low-paying employment.
Right, physical jobs.
This physical labor market often pulls young men out of the education system early. They can leave school at 16 and immediately find work in agriculture or basic construction.
But as Grenada pivots toward a service economy, the skills required are no longer physical strength or agrarian knowledge.
Exactly. The new economy demands analytical thinking, administrative competence, and communication skills, traits that are formalized and nurtured in higher education.
So women, perhaps less incentivized by the immediate pull of manual labor, stayed in the system, acquired those advanced skills, and positioned themselves perfectly for the new economic reality.
Precisely. They became the intellectual engine of the service transition.
So what does this all mean? We have a system with highly individualized class sizes, universal access, and a highly educated female demographic emerging. What is the actual return on investment for all this?
When you look at the outcomes on page 9, the data is staggering. The literacy metrics are exceptional. Adult literacy sits at an impressive 97+%.
Wow.
And youth literacy is effectively maxed out at 99%.
It's total literacy, a society where almost everyone can read and write.
And it isn't just basic literacy. When tracking the historical trajectory of the primary school completion rate, despite some historical fluctuations in earlier decades, it stabilized at over 97% after the year 2010.
So they aren't just starting the educational process, they are completing the foundational stages.
Exactly. It means Grenada operates with incredibly high input-output efficiency in basic education.
So, synthesis time. We have 99% youth literacy, classes of 16 kids, and almost total primary completion. This isn't just a feel-good social metric, this is an economic weapon.
It absolutely is. This high literacy rate was the absolute prerequisite, the foundational bedrock that allowed the country to transition its workforce into the service sector.
Because you literally cannot run a modern service economy. You can't manage international tourism, handle offshore banking compliance, or develop digital infrastructure with an illiterate population.
You can't run a service economy without a highly literate population, full stop.
You literally cannot read the manual for the new operating system if you don't have basic literacy.
Right.
Grenada successfully upgraded the human capital of its entire population before the economic software was fully swapped.
And that strategic foresight is what made the next phase of their national journey possible.
Which perfectly transitions us into part 3 of our deep dive, the economic metamorphosis. From the historical spice aisle to a modern service hub.
Let's look at the money.
Yes, exactly. We've looked at the people, we've looked at their upgraded capabilities. Now let's look at the macro leap outlined across pages 3 through 7. The data detailing this structural shift is nothing short of breathtaking.
The macro-level leap provides the starkest evidence of this transformation. The data tracks total GDP in 2015 constant dollars.
Which, again, is vital because it strips away inflation. It gives us the real, tangible purchasing power of the economy over time.
Right. So in 1977, the total GDP was roughly $295 million. By 2022, that figure had climbed to over $1 billion.
$1 billion. That is nearly a four-fold increase in real economic output over just a few decades. For a small island with limited physical resources, that is a phenomenal success story.
It really is.
But here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at the data tracking the annual GDP growth rate over this same period, right at the very end of the timeline, there is a massive anomaly. The year 2020.
Oh, yes.
The data shows a violent 14.0% contraction in a single year. Not a dip, a crater.
And this highlights the double-edged sword of global integration. A 14% contraction in a single 12-month period is cataclysmic.
It's hard to even conceptualize a drop that steep. I mean, we all know what caused it, the global COVID shock in 2020. And how does that external event manifest so violently inside this specific economy?
It exposes their core vulnerability. The 2020 crash was an external shock that devastated their tourism and service sectors. When a nation transitions from a locally focused agricultural economy to a globally integrated service economy heavily reliant on international tourism, it attaches its economic fate entirely to global mobility.
Right.
When the pandemic hit, global travel simply ceased to exist. For an island nation whose absolute lifeblood is visitors arriving by plane and cruise ship, the revenue stream didn't just slow down, it evaporated.
It's the ultimate vulnerability of the new software. If the internet goes down, your shiny new cloud-based software is a useless brick. If the planes stop flying, the service economy starves to death.
Exactly. However, the data also reveals an incredible underlying resilience. Following that massive 14% drop, the subsequent years show a rapid V-shaped post-shock recovery.
The economy bounced back almost as violently as it fell.
It did. The foundation was strong enough to weather the storm.
But let's step away from these macro billion-dollar GDP figures for a moment, because throwing around high-level data doesn't always translate to the reality on the ground. We need to look at what this transformation actually meant for the standard of living, which is on page 4.
Right, and the research addresses this by distinguishing between nominal data and purchasing power parity, or PPP.
So looking at GDP based on PPP, the key data point here is stunning. The PPP per capita grew from roughly $6,400 in 1990 to an impressive $17,751 in 2023.
That's a massive jump.
It is. But let's ground this PPP concept for the listener. What does that actually mean for someone trying to buy groceries or pay rent in Grenada? Why is this number so much higher than the raw exchange rate?
Purchasing power parity is a crucial economic metric because it adjusts for the domestic cost of living.
Okay, how?
Well, if you simply take Grenada's total GDP, divided by the population, and convert it to US dollars using the standard exchange rate, you get a relatively modest nominal number.
Right.
But that nominal number is blind to local reality. It doesn't tell you how much a loaf of bread, a haircut, or a bus ride actually costs in Grenada compared to, say, New York. PPP is much higher than the nominal dollar figure because domestic service costs in Grenada are relatively low.
Think of it this way. If you look purely at the exchange rate, it doesn't tell the whole story. If I earn $50,000 a year living in Manhattan, I'm likely struggling to afford a tiny apartment and basic groceries.
Right.
But if I earn that exact same nominal $50,000 living in a small rural town, my purchasing power is massive. The actual lived reality, the purchasing power of the average Grenadian, essentially doubled over 3 decades.
Exactly. The true metric of their successful economic transition is that the material well-being doubled. They can buy twice as much life as they could in 1990.
Which is incredible. But what exactly did they transition from and to? The specific sector breakdown in the data reveals a really stark story. Pages 5, 6, and 7 are basically titled The Death of Agriculture.
The 100% stacked bar chart tells a dramatic story. The structural shift is absolute.
Let's hear the numbers.
In 1977, agriculture's share of the national GDP was 17.7%. This was the era of the spice aisle. Grenada was globally famous for its production of nutmeg, mace, and cocoa.
It was their identity.
Yes. But as the decades progress, you see that slice of the economic pie wither away. By recently, agriculture represents a mere 5.2% of the GDP.
The agricultural sector just gets squeezed into a tiny sliver. But usually when a nation moves away from agriculture, they move into industry and manufacturing next. Did that happen?
The data clearly shows it did not. Manufacturing has been fundamentally marginalized. It has stagnated at roughly 3 to 5% of GDP for decades.
Wow. Just completely flat.
And not just flat, but highly unstable. There are wild fluctuations. For instance, there was an anomalous jump of greater than 50% in the late 90s, but that spike was immediately followed by a severe slump.
So an incredibly weak manufacturing base. And the expert analysis in the report points out that this creates a dangerous reliance on imported consumer goods.
Exactly. If you don't make things, you have to buy them from somewhere else.
So if agriculture is dead and manufacturing never launched, what is the lifeline?
The service lifeline. Services grew from 60.1% in 1977 to over 65%. In 2022, the service value hit a historic high of roughly $2.43 billion.
It is the absolute engine of the nation. But isn't a 65% reliance on services kind of putting all your eggs in one basket?
Yes, it is. Services, heavily driven by tourism, absorb employment and generate foreign exchange. But as the 2020 data showed, they bring extreme volatility tied to global market whims.
Which brings us to part 4, the guardrails, governance, law, and external vulnerabilities. Because to manage such an extreme economic pivot and survive those global shocks, a country needs strong institutions, but it also has to manage its checkbook.
Let's look at Grenada's systemic health, starting on page 11.
Right, the World Governance Indicators, or WGI.
When you look at the WGI, 2 metrics really stand out: voice and accountability. consistently ranks above the 70th percentile.
Which is great.
And rule of law is remarkably stable above the 60th percentile.
Okay, contextualize this for us. What did that mean for Grenada in the real world?
Within the Caribbean region, Grenada is a mature, stable institutional environment. This provides the essential security blanket for foreign direct investment. International investors need to know that property rights are respected and contracts will be enforced.
That makes sense. But looking at the control of corruption chart on page 12, I see a peak of 91.4 in the mid-2000s, but it's been dropping recently. Should we be worried about that slide?
If we connect this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
yes. Institutional consistency isn't guaranteed. A slide in corruption control is a critical warning light for future financial risk and foreign capital flight.
Because if corruption goes up, it acts like a hidden tax on that foreign investment.
Exactly. If the corruption tax becomes too high, foreign capital will simply fly to a different island with better controls.
Speaking of financial risk, we need to talk about the financial safety margin on page 13, the external debt and the savings account.
The data shows that long-term external debt expanded alongside the economy, growing from the tens of millions in the 1970s to over $340 million recently.
Okay, but debt is only half the story. What about the reserves?
Total reserves hit a historic high of roughly $423 million in 2022.
So they have $423 million in the bank. That sounds great.
It does, but there is a massive flashing warning sign here. The months of import coverage provided by these reserves fluctuate between just 2 to 4 months.
Wait, 2 to 4 months. That's it?
That's it. Having only 2 to 4 months of import coverage means there is constant underlying payment pressure.
Because they have to import everything. Since their manufacturing sector is so weak, they have to buy their food, fuel, everything from outside.
Exactly. If a hurricane hits or a pandemic stops tourism, the dollars stop flowing in. Their ability to buy essential imported goods is immediately threatened.
It is a razor-thin margin of error. Which brings us to the final part of our deep dive, the environmental reality and the future playbook. Because for a small island state, none of that economic stuff matters if the physical environment is at risk.
The environmental data on page 14 presents a fascinating climate paradox.
Let's hear the green footprint.
Grenada has an excellent ecological conservation tradition, maintaining a highly stable forest cover of 52.1%.
More than half the island is preserved forest. That's amazing.
And their carbon footprint is tiny. Per capita CO2 emissions grew from 0.11 tons in the 70s to only about 0.8 to 1.0 tons today.
So they are emitting practically nothing. You know, it's like they are basically passengers on a global bus driven by heavy emitters.
That's a great analogy.
They'll keep their own seat perfectly clean, 52% forest cover, tiny emissions, but if the bus crashes, they still go through the windshield.
Exactly. The absolute emissions are negligible, but as a small island, climate resilience preparing for sea level rise and extreme weather is an existential necessity, not just a policy choice.
So knowing all this, what does the data suggest they do next? How do they update the software again? The research concludes on page 15 with a dual path forward, summarizing core strengths and major challenges.
Right. Their core strengths are high literacy, stable services, and mature governance. Their major challenges are economic volatility, aging, and low industrial diversity.
And what are the 3 strategic recommendations from the data to fix this?
First, digital transformation. They need to export communication technologies to break the singular reliance on traditional physical tourism.
Makes total sense with a 99% literate youth population. What's the second?
Energy autonomy. Currently, renewable energy generation is painfully low, under 1%.
Under 1% for a sunny Caribbean island.
Yes. They desperately need investment here to stop bleeding capital on imported fossil fuels. It would massively improve that 2 to 4 month import coverage window.
And the third recommendation?
Social security reinforcement. They must restructure social insurance and welfare spending to support the looming aging population trend we identified at the very start of our deep dive.
Because the youth hostel is now a boutique hotel for retirees.
Exactly.
When you step back and look at the totality of this data, it's an incredible narrative. This is the tale of a nation that realized the age of the Spice Isle was ending, educated its populace, and successfully rebooted as a global service hub. They overcame massive external shocks against all odds.
It really is a phenomenal transition.
But the transition isn't over. And before we close out, there is one final provocative thought that emerges when you synthesize all these separate data points.
What's that?
Well, we established that Grenada has near 100% literacy, We know they have a highly educated female workforce dominating tertiary education, and we know they face a mandate to digitally transform to escape the volatility of physical tourism.
Right.
So, as the world moves rapidly toward remote work and AI, could a nation like Grenada, physically vulnerable to climate change, but intellectually robust, pioneer the ultimate borderless service economy?
Oh, that's a fascinating concept.
Could the next evolution of this island state exist entirely in the cloud, where their primary economic export isn't nutmeg or even hotel room, but the cognitive labor of its citizens exported seamlessly across borders?
It would perfectly bypass their physical climate threat and leverage their massive investment in human capital. It's a completely new operating system for a sovereign state.
It really is. It's something for you, the listener, to mull over as we watch how nations adapt to the 21st century. As always, the data reviews the past, but wisdom guides the future. We'll see you next time as we unpack another stack of sources. Keep questioning the data.